The first main example of homeostasis that we're going to have a look at is thermoregulation. So, what is thermoregulation? Well, if homeostasis is the maintenance of a constant internal environment despite changes to the external environment, thermoregulation is the maintenance of a heat production and heat loss system in order to sustain our body temperature at 36.8 degrees, aka thermoregulation is our body's ability to maintain a constant temperature despite changes to the external environment. So, how do we detect temperature? Well, we have two kinds of temperature receptors. We have peripheral thermoreceptors found in the skin, and we also have central thermoreceptors found in the hypothalamus. They detect different things. So, peripheral thermoreceptors detect external temperature changes, while the central thermoreceptors found in the hypothalamus detect internal temperature changes. Now, the thermoreceptors found in the skin, again, include cold or hot receptors. Okay, so they are either sensitive to colder temperatures or warmer temperatures. Those found in the hypothalamus are sensitive to both hot and cold. Okay, sensitive to both increases and decreases in body blood temperature. So, why is it important? This graph down the bottom here, we can see the rate of reaction of all of our metabolic reactions in the body compared to temperature. And what we can see is that our body peaks at 36.8 degrees. Okay? Any higher, and our body gradually and then very quickly begins to decrease in its ability to function optimally, and that's going to lead to cells denaturing, proteins denaturing, and being unable to complete that particular function. When we get too cold, a similar thing happens, but instead of denaturing, our cells are so slow, and these reactions take place without the necessary energy, so that things take much longer, and our body also can't sustain this, and it will lead to death. So, how do we manage our metabolic rate? Well, some important definitions to start. Number one is metabolism. Metabolism is the sum of all the chemical reactions that occur in an organism to maintain life. It is not your ability to just break down food. Okay. Metabolic rate, however, is the rate at which energy is released by the breakdown of food. So when people refer to their metabolism, and in the context of food, what they're really referring to is their metabolic rate. And what we're talking about with metabolic rate is your ability to break down carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins during cellular respiration and other processes like deamination in order to release energy. And what we know from this, and the whole reason that we're going down this metabolic pathway, is that some of this energy is released in the form of heat. Heat is a byproduct of cellular respiration, and it becomes very important for us to be able to maintain our body temperature through use of this latent heat. So, like our lizard friend here, we have a few key ways of both absorbing and releasing heat from our bodies. So, the first mechanism is convection. Convection currents exist in the world, and this is where air is going to pass by us, and it is going to take heat away from our body. Secondly is radiation. We both radiate heat to the environment, so we lose heat from radiation, but we can also gain thermal energy from the environment thanks to radiation from things like the sun. Next, evaporation. So evaporation works in conjunction with convection to a certain extent. Evaporation is where liquid sweat that accumulates on the surface of our skin, when it evaporates, it goes from a liquid to a gas, and it releases that thermal energy in that process. And finally, conduction. Anything that we touch, we conduct heat either into, or we take heat from it, depending on which is warmer and cooler respectively. So, when we're talking about heat exchange, again, quick recap, our body can lose and gain heat by radiation, convection, and conduction. Our body can only lose heat, okay, via evaporation. So we can't gain heat by evaporating, okay? However, we can gain heat from radiation, convection, and conduction. So our body is constantly doing this. It's balancing all the heat gain with its heat loss. And if it does this just right, and if it achieves that homeostatic, that perfect balance, we should be sitting right in the middle at 36.8 degrees. So we're now going to look at some examples of when this doesn't go to plan, when there isn't this perfect homeostasis, and the first example is when you have a low body temperature. So from a neural perspective, when you have a low body temperature, two things happen. Number one, there's vasoconstriction of the arterioles to the skin, and you begin to shiver. From an endocrine perspective, thyroxine is released and adrenaline is also released. From a behavioural perspective, well, I want you to think, what would you do? If you're feeling cold, from a behaviour perspective, you might go to a warmer place, like a warm room. You might turn a heater on. You might put some extra layers onto your body, so like an extra jacket or a jumper. These are all behavioural mechanisms which can help us when we feel a low body temperature. But let's look in more detail now at how these feedback loops interact with our understanding of thermoregulation. So our first one, vasoconstriction, occurs due to, again, that low body temperature. It is detected by thermoreceptors in the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus is our modulator in this instance as well. It sends an impulse along sympathetic nerves. Now the effector in this case, as we've mentioned on the last slide, is that arterioles in the skin are going to constrict. Vasoconstriction is where the arterioles get smaller, their diameter decreases, okay? And what this results in, the response of the arterioles constricting, is that there is less blood flow to the skin, and that's going to mean that there is less heat loss via convection, less heat loss by radiation, and additionally, we're going to give more heat around our vital organs, so keep our core temperature quite warm. Now, the negative feedback is always going to be the opposite here, and it is going to be increased body temperature in this instance because we had an initial low body temperature. So maybe I'll highlight here the stimulus and the negative feedback in the same colour, but they are in fact the opposite of one another. Up next, our next mechanism of warming ourselves up is by shivering. So again, our stimulus is low body temperature, and I'm going to skip to the end result here. Shivering ultimately is going to do the opposite of our stimulus, which is increase body temperature. So much the same, I'm going to highlight things now in yellow, which are the same, and green for things that are different. So the receptor, once again, is thermoreceptors in the hypothalamus. This is the same. The hypothalamus, again, sends an impulse. Notice this time that it's not along sympathetic nerves. Instead, the hypothalamus sends an impulse along motor neurons to skeletal muscle. So this is slightly different now. We're no longer talking about the arterioles in the skin. We're talking skeletal muscle. And the response is to shiver. What is shivering? It is an oscillating, rhythmic muscle tremor. Okay? It is frequent muscle contraction and relaxation. And what this does is it increases our cellular respiration. And as we've mentioned previously, a byproduct of cellular respiration is heat. So by shivering, we are doing more cellular respiration. We are increasing the amount of heat that we are producing. As we now move on, we've now got an endocrine feedback mechanism for this. And so again, the stimulus remains the same, low body temperature. The negative feedback ultimately remains the same, increased body temperature. Things that remain the same include that the receptor in this case is thermoreceptors in the hypothalamus, but in this case we're now looking at a hormonal response. And so this is a little bit different, so I'm going to highlight it in pink. Now, for those of you who may remember back to when we looked at the action of TSH in the first topic on the endocrine system, this remains the same here. So the hypothalamus is going to detect it with thermoreceptors before secreting TSHRF, and TSHRF is going to travel to the anterior pituitary, and the anterior pituitary is then going to release TSH. TSH is going to travel through the blood to the thyroid, and that's going to cause the thyroid to secrete thyroxine. Now, in terms of the effector is different here as well. The effector is that thyroxine traveling through the blood and going to all body cells, and what does it do? It increases the rate of cellular respiration, And just as we saw with shivering, when we increase the rate of cellular respiration, we are also producing more heat. Consequently, that is going to increase our body temperature. Our final mechanism, okay, for low body temperature. And you'll notice here that it's ever so slightly different now. The stimulus here is stress, okay, rapid heat loss. So I want you to think stepping into an ice bath or something like that, a really rapid loss of heat. This is again detected by the hypothalamus, okay? Now the hypothalamus and the thermoreceptors in the hypothalamus then stimulate the sympathetic nervous system, and that is going to stimulate the secretion of adrenaline from the adrenal medulla. Adrenaline is going to travel through the blood to all body cells, and similar to the action of thyroxine, it's going to increase the rate of cellular respiration, producing more heat. Now again, if the stimulus here was rapid heat loss, it is going to be increased body temperature to offset that rapid heat loss. So those are all the mechanisms that we can employ in our body, apart from behavioural mechanisms, to increase our body temperature when it decreases. What we're going to look at now is what happens when your body temperature gets too hot. So from a neural perspective, we can vasodilate our arterioles to the skin, we can sweat, and from an endocrine perspective, we can inhibit the release of thyroxine. From a behavioural perspective, same way that we spoke about what would happen when your body temperature decreases. Well, when you get too warm, you could take excess layers of clothing off. You could find a cooler place to sit. Maybe if you're in the sun, you would go find some shade. You could ingest cool water and cool drinks and things like that to help bring your body temperature down. But let's look at our first feedback mechanism, so vasodilation. So again, the stimulus in this instance is our new one. It is high body temperature. Our negative feedback is going to be the opposite of that, so decreased body temperature. The receptor, it's much the same again, thermoreceptors in the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus sends an impulse, and that impulse travels to the effector, which is the arterioles in the skin. The arterioles in the skin dilate. What is this going to do? Well, it's going to increase the blood flow to the skin, resulting in more heat loss via convection and radiation, and consequently, there's going to be less heat around vital organs. So I'm actually going to remove that there. There should be less blood, thus heat, around vital organs, as it's all travelled to the skin instead. Up next, sweating. Again, high body temperature. Opposite of that for the negative feedback is decreasing the body temperature. Again, thermoreceptors in the hypothalamus are triggered. When we're talking about sweating, the hypothalamus sends an impulse via sympathetic nerves. These sympathetic nerves target the effector in this case, which is sweat glands. And what does the sweat glands begin to do? They increase sweat production. Now, that right there is the response. However, we want to take it a little bit further, and we want to say that increasing sweat production doesn't actually cool us down. It is what happens next. It helps cool us down via evaporation. And again, as we mentioned earlier, it's as that water changes into a gas that excess heat is removed from the body. As we move down to our next example, so inhibition of thyroxine, this is just the opposite of what we spoke about with low body temperature. So again, our stimulus is a high temperature, negative feedback is a decrease of that high body temperature. When we're talking about the receptor, it is thermoreceptors in the hypothalamus, and in this case, instead of releasing TSH-RF, TSH releasing factor, we're going to release TSH inhibiting factor. Now, this is going to travel to the anterior pituitary, and at the anterior pituitary, it is going to inhibit the release of TSH. As a consequence, less TSH is not going to trigger the thyroid gland to release thyroxine, so our effector is going to be that there is less thyroxine traveling through the blood, and the response is going to be a decrease in the rate of cellular respiration, and as a consequence, less heat being produced by this mechanism. So this next diagram is a very basic representation, again showing, okay, up the top left we can see that there are going to be external factors which cause our body temperature to increase. That's detected by the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus can either go down the line of vasodilation, or it can help you with sweating. That's going to lead to cooling and bringing you back down here to our set point. Okay. We can then have the reverse of that. We could have external factors causing you to cool down. Hypothalamus detects this, causes either vasoconstriction or shivering, which is going to lead to warming, leading you back up here to that set point right in the middle. So that is thermoregulation. I know it's been very quick going through it all, quite a few feedback loops for you to review, all of them very important come exam time.